Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Now, we are, as of recording this, 13 days out from Election Day, which means by the time you watch this, it will be 12 days out from Election Day. And if you're watching this on the live premiere, it will be about 3 hours, 4 hours before the second or third, if you want to call it. I don't know how you want to consider it, presidential debate between, of course, Trump and Biden, which we will probably end up making a special episode covering, but well, let's see how interesting it is. But like I said, more likely than not, we will make it a special episode covering it. If not, we'll cover it just in a segment on the next regular episode. But without further ado, we're going to start out like we did last week and do a little bit of election predictions. Now, ours have changed, one more so drastically than the other, but in the top left corner, you have mine here, and the bottom right, you have GSP's. Now, I'll explain what I did here. The polling out of Arizona looked pretty good, so I gave it back to Trump. It was iffy there for a while, but I think the Republicans can eke it out. It's traditionally a Republican state. I know there's an uphill battle. I know the Senate is leaning blue, but that doesn't necessarily mean the president will flip as well. I mean, we saw this case in Ohio, actually, where a senator, a Democratic senator, won the same election Trump also won 2016. I think Michigan was also a similar case, if not Pennsylvania too. But a lot of those blue or swing states in the Midwest and the north of the country voted differently when it came to the Senate and the presidency. So we could get a case like that in Arizona. But the reason I took Pennsylvania away from Trump is I'm sure you've all heard that they extended the deadline for the mail-in ballots to 3 days after the election. So that'll be completely legitimate and honest. I have no doubt about that. But I do think in a genuinely fair competition, without all the shenanigans going on, Trump would be able to pull off Pennsylvania again. But I don't see that happening under current circumstances. I'm not saying he isn't doing well there, but at the end of the day, I think they have enough to flip it, and I think the Democrats are hedging their bets on Pennsylvania being the deciding factor in this election right now. And that's why I gave it back into the blue column. Now, I still feel pretty confident with the states I've read, especially Ohio and Wisconsin, which you will differ with me on, we'll get into in a second. But I did flip-flop on Michigan. I thought about putting it in the red, mainly because the news coming out of Michigan is that Republican registration, party registration, is through the roof right now. That doesn't always correlate. For example, the Democrats did have higher registration in states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin in the month leading up to the 2016 election, and those states all went red. But I do think there is a general reason for confidence. Now, I also think the polling, maybe not as bad as it was in 2016, but I still don't think it's entirely too off. And then one other one to keep your eye on, I still reluctantly put in the blue column because I honestly didn't know what to do, and I suppose I just went with the default. Minnesota, there have been a lot of complaints about, especially in the cities, a lack of police presence and increasing crime, and a lot of people have been just pouring out of the cities as well. So Minnesota, it was lost by Trump by about 0.5% last election. So there's the slight opportunity it could go back, and it could go to being a Republican state this election, but just I'm erring on the side of caution and putting it where it's been in, since 1976. Keep in mind, this is the only state in the 84 election that voted Democrat because it was Mondale's home state, and it was just barely lost. So, but again, it seems to be a blue stronghold, even more so than these other traditionally Democratic states, because it's just such razor-thin margins every time, especially recently in Minnesota, not to mention on their state-level elections. They go Democrat a lot, so like I said, I'm inclined to give it to Trump by the skin of his teeth, but something interesting about this map, you'll notice my map, is it is 270 Trump, 268 Biden. Say Biden flips Nebraska's 2nd district or Maine's 2nd district. That's a tie right there, so we're in dangerous territories insofar as that's concerned, and it's very possible a tie could pop up this election. If there was going to be any election where it did, it would be, in which case it would be left to the state delegations and the House of Representatives, because Again, the Electoral College, some states allow for faithless electors, so all it would take is one to defect on their state delegation's vote and flip the election. But again, that would be chaos in and of itself. But I'll hand it over to you to give your descriptor for the states you flipped.
Yeah. So now I do think that, even Wisconsin has like a slim chance of going blue as well. I guess in the same way that you described Minnesota could go red. Um, Ohio as well. Now I've gone around Twitter and looked around, and a lot of people seem to say the same thing, that Ohio and also Arizona could possibly, go blue this election. I'm also playing the devil's advocate. I'm trying to give like a not necessarily a worst case scenario, but a
Invoking the
worst.
Slavic pessimism.
Yes. You lower the expectations, and if you win big, or you win bigger. So, and like you, I do believe that there's going to be some kind of shenanigans with, late mail-in voting coming in. Maybe something else to think about is, what if like the rioting like starts to reach a fever pitch, let's say even on the eve of the election?
Oh boy, and we're gonna get into this in a minute, but they will be voting on Barrett's nomination 8 days before the election, so
Yeah.
that's bound to cause some sort of even quote unquote peaceful protest, some sort of just unrest or disruption of normal life for a significant segment of the at least politically active population of the country.
I mean, yeah, we're going to see large white women in red capes getting violent, like joining the BLM protests. It's going to be scary.
The wine ant riots. Liquor stores, lock your doors extra tight. On, let's see, what day would that be? Let me pull up my little calendar here. On October 26th. Okay, so just that week, just be extra careful, especially guard the box wine because it's going down.
Yeah, if you want to invest in box wine, I mean, it's
No, it's actually a horrible idea because they're just going to loot it. The stocks are going to tank. Now, of course, this is amateur financial advice. Don't hold us responsible for any dumb investments you may make. Now that that's out of the way, we can continue.
Yeah, you take the box wine, I'll take the Michelob. Um, yeah, I just think there might be an intimidation factor that some people will think to exploit. Like, do you really want another 4 more years of Trump? Because this is what you're going to get. There's a lot of people that just want this to end. So, I mean, that is something you have to think about, especially with normies, True, there's a lot of businesses that, are closed, permanently closed. The double whammy of COVID and looting and arson, for a lot of people has meant the end. But for people who have managed to eschew both those, they might want, like, for their business to have some modicum of peace, let's say. Now, is that really going to happen? Is that like a realistic expectation?
Yeah.
I think you can easily argue no.
That's
right?
That's the Moldbug argument, isn't it? If we just let the liberals take back control, they'll calm down for a few years. Now, I do agree insofar as that for the first few months, they would give you a break. They would give you a breather, let you calm down, let you get into what I would say a false sense of security. I think coincidentally around the time Kamala Harris would take over for Biden is when it would go into overdrive. So it would be buying a few months of peace in exchange for it just going completely overboard. Whereas with Trump, there's the case where it may be like a Nixon 72, where the back of, in Nixon's case, the hippies were completely broken. In Trump's case, whatever you want to call these very interesting individuals or in their movements as well. So there's a case to be made that it might be the final demoralizing blow if Trump wins the election. I wouldn't go as far as say that, but also keep that in mind. Whereas even an old white man winning would be something of a morale boost for them, especially with his woman of color running mate. And like I said, they may calm down for a few months, but all it takes is getting them whipped up into a frenzy. No, no, probably around 2022 with the congressional elections, which I haven't even hazarded a guess on the congressional elections in this election. But again, I'll probably get into that sometime soon. But again, all it takes is them getting whipped up to that. I mean, you have to remember, the Black Lives Matter movement initially started under the Obama administration. It started in 2014, 2015 with Ferguson. That was all
Yeah.
under Obama, under a Democratic-controlled government, Democratic-controlled Department of Justice. So it's not necessarily just Republicans being in power. They will do this when Democrats are in power to push the Democrats further.
Right. Right. If in some ways the Bernie Bros might have a point. Like they feel that they can whisper in Biden, or maybe rather yell in Biden's ear to move things along. But for all their naivete, maybe some of them do get it. Like maybe some of them do understand on some fundamental level that, like the uh, elite power structure of the U.S. and the direction that it wants to go is on their side. They might not be doing the same speed limit, but as you say, uh, if they had to push Obama along, they would, right?
Yeah.
The thing is, as bad as the protests were, of course, there was Baltimore and Ferguson and so on, and there was arson and killings even then. They did subside, right? I mean, they lasted maybe for a few days, maybe the better part of a week, but that was it. And what's fueling the protests now is basically just Trump being in office. It's patently illegitimate, but they have really bought the lie that Trump is this incredible fascist leader, this dictator of America. You have normie moms. If you look at their AVI, these are women in their late 50s, some of them in their 60s, who really believe that Trump is a dictator, right? And like when you look at the kind of powers that he could have exerted during COVID lockdown, right?
Yeah,
To
he
the
could have
point
he could
where
have emulated any Democratic governor, Cuomo, Whitmer, who's the guy in charge of California? I know it's not Jerry Brown anymore. He's the ancient guy that just left office. Name escapes me for the life of me, but some other really entrenched Democrat. He could have done all of that on a national level, but he didn't even touch the issue, which again, possibly one of his bigger mistakes. Maybe not. Time will tell. We'll get into that in a couple minutes, actually, about the virus itself and its sort of resurgence, but continue.
right. Um, so here was this amazing opportunity. It would have aligned with an election year, and he would have had plausible deniability. He also would have thrown the Democrats into contradiction because by May, they were very adamant about lockdown and about safety and about a coherent approach and so on and so on and so on. And Trump wasn't coherent about it. He would flip, either way. And I suppose if he had used the excuse, that a dictator would, that's plausible. I have to protect this country. We have this killer virus. It has killed over 50,000 Americans.
Yeah,
It's going
back when
to
he was
kill.
doing the invisible enemy rhetoric, I thought he was going in that direction because it seemed like a build up to that, but it was I don't know. I guess it was sort of just something he really didn't follow through on.
No, and he could have. And so, so what you have is half the country is convinced that they have to get rid of him, or they'll lose their democracy, which is basically just rule of minorities. Essentially, that's what it is. Um, that's a liberal democracy to them is the only worthwhile democracy. There cannot be a democracy where the many rule, right? And um, so, anyways, Trump didn't really take the bait, and what that allowed to happen was it allowed them to basically burn their own cities, and that caused a spectacle. And that was, I mean, it was a shock for a lot of people. It was a shock for people outside of the U.S., to be honest. Many people had not seen anything like that. Now, at first, in the first week of June, for instance, they said, well, we had riots like this in the late 60s, in Detroit, for instance, right? But I think when July and August rolled around, like, we couldn't really have those comparisons anymore. And but I'd also like to note that there were journalists within the first 2-3 days of June who were speculating that Trump would actually call upon some kind of a curfew, some kind of a grab for power in order to deal with COVID and the riots. So they fully expected him to do that. And Trump knew not to do that, right? So they wanted to bait him with, the fascist dictator meme, right? When he didn't take it, I think that's when the strategy changed. They had to prolong it. They were obligated to prolong it. They were obligated to provoke him as much as possible. And then the strategy changed into something else altogether. Then it was a threat. They revealed that they are actually in power. And it was basically, if you reelect this guy, and all of this is really about the reelection, if you reelect Trump, we're going to burn this country down. We're going to have a kind of civil conflict, like really not since the 19th century. So you can see how this strategy evolved depending on Trump's action, or rather inaction. And I think there's still some of that, but I don't know, except for Portland and Seattle, there doesn't seem to be a lot of protesting. But however, it could very well be in the last, say, 4 or 5 days before the election. There is a weekend before the Tuesday where we might see a reemergence of this. And how that's going to play out, I don't know. I don't know if the Democrats can do it one more time as a threat without looking like actually they're in charge. And I don't know if a lot of voters themselves can really speculate into the future in such a way as we pointed out, that maybe Trump is reelected and maybe the protests, maybe they go on for another 6 months, but that's it. No one has the energy for it anymore. That's also a possibility, because that's also what happened, as you said, with Nixon's reelection.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways it can go, and honestly, I know we do a geopolitical forecasting show, but this is honestly a bit out of my reach. I really cannot say for sure, but if you force me to make it, number one, the election prediction, I think Trump by the skin of his teeth. Number two, I do think it would push the protests into an overdrive to the point where they end up destroying themselves, because it's just that last bit of spent energy, whereas they get a vacation, if you will, for a few months, maybe even a few years under a Democratic administration before they really have to pick it up again. So I do think Trump is probably the best bet to put this kind of thing to an end, because, like I said, like you said, it may be, again, another half year of this, but by May, June of 2021, they may have just completely exhausted themselves and spent every bit of political capital they had with the American people. So, really, time remains to be seen, and
Mhm.
it could create a relative temper. Since either way, eventually there's going to be a temporary peace, in my opinion. That depends on when it happens and how long it is. That's the real question.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think that covers everything for at least the electoral politics. If you want to move on to the Supreme Court chaos.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go.
So the main news out of that, of course, is Barrett already had her hearings, which went relatively well. Not, just the usual standard conservatism mixed in with the "I'm a strong, empowered woman, but I'm also a Republican" sort of rhetoric. Which, again, more stuff I just honestly yawn at. Nothing that really struck me one way or another. My personal opinion on the woman is like, better than whatever the Democrats have put up, but it's still kind of lackluster. Not really that thrilling, but I do think what I mainly want to talk about here, that the idea to hold a vote 8 days before the election is a complete disaster. Even if they held it tomorrow, 12 days before the election, I think that would be a substantial improvement over what it would do to energizing the Democrats. Because when you do it that close, I mean, look, if Obama would have gotten his way and gotten Merrick Garland through, it would have been at the beginning of 2016. The outrage about that would have already died. It would have been a settled issue. If
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
even when they nominated Kavanaugh in early October, I know it's a midterm, so it was less substantial in terms of election, but it's still an election year no less. It, I think, had less of an impact on the election, especially considering the fact that the Republicans actually gained in the Senate and didn't lose anything, which again is the Senate's responsibility to make the nomination. Well, vote on the nomination. It is so. Again, a lot of power lies with them because they ultimately have the final say over the president's choice. And this could get very nasty. Now, I do think the Republicans have the votes for it conventionally, but it could get very nasty if Mike Pence is the tie breaking vote in a 50-50 split on this nomination. That could do wonders for the Democratic base since, okay, you have this
Mhm.
allegedly far right Christian fundamentalist who's going to make a handmaid's tale thing, whatever. They're obsessed with real, and women aren't going to have any rights, blah, 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 whatever. And you have the vice president who's this evil super evangelical who hates the LGBTQ CIA, etc., casting this high breaking vote on that. I think that could do a lot of damage to the Republican cause in the election. Now, of course, a lot of the MAGA people, a lot of the standard Trump supporters, be like, Trump did it again. He's winning again. Second term, he got another.
Yeah.
He got 3 Supreme Court justices, which again, I think is it's worthy of celebration to a degree. But I think that enthusiasm would be much less than the absolute shrieks of terror coming from the Democrats. I think the Democrats have a more organized apparatus to mobilize that sort of, whether it just be political action or just voting. So I think I think they have to vote on it now, but I do think pushing it back that far was a mistake. And it's not like they can risk it and set the vote after the election. I mean, they could do a lame duck thing where it is sort of in your face because even if the Democrats take back the Senate in the next election, that doesn't take session until January. So they would still have the end of November and all of December to nominate her, which I don't know, a lame duck nomination might be better. I honestly don't know in this case because either way there'd be another Republican justice on the court, but I do think pushing it to that point is treading in very dangerous water for the Republicans in terms of what the Democratic reaction will be.
Yeah. And they do get energized. I mean, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, they were quite energized by that. The Republicans, of course, said that they would seek her replacement. But the truth is, the Democrats would still have reacted even if Trump had not said that they would look for a replacement uh, before the election. And the reason I say that is because they could come up with another narrative, such as we have to ensure he loses because if he wins, he's going to get some fascist um, some fascist judge in there. And now Barrett is, I think, hardly that. There's some rulings that she has had, which can be interpreted like maybe standing up for corporations. In any case, like she isn't what people thought she might be. And her selection from a political strategy was very good. She has these two black Haitian children that she's adopted. And, you see a lot of,
Well, didn't you hear the
frankly, a lot
news
of
that
white women.
about her continued humanitarianism, that she actually recently took in a recovering drug addict by the name of Hunter?
Right. Yes, that's right. That's right, Hunter. Um, we've got a situation where now she is a known. She's not as terrible as people had thought. So again, I don't want to wander too far off, but their narrative machine that they have a worthy foe, and that there's a potential for a kind of fascism of the sort that was witnessed in the middle of the 20th century is always there. The potential is always there. It's ridiculous, of course. It's mythological, but it is something that can rely on, and it is effective. Anyhow, yeah, they can always use it. It doesn't matter whether um, he would have replaced her before or after the election.
Yeah, I agree with that definitely. That they would have found a way to mobilize this anyway, but I do think they will having that mobilization right before the election to the point where, because if you do that a few months, there's the chance it could always peter out, where it just doesn't
Mm-hmm.
carry the weight. It goes on for a few weeks, maybe a month, but not until election day. But that definitely will carry over to election day. Now, that also depends on the people who've already cast their votes, because looking at it, I think a lot of the determined Democrats have already cast their votes based on what we had, whether that be by early voting or mail in. And then the Republicans, they're more likely to make that up on election day proper. But I think these so called undecideds, or the people whose vote could flip just because of one issue like this, that's where it could really become dangerous. Maybe they're susceptible to propaganda from both sides, where they'll believe pretty much any right or left wing talking point thrown at them. The typical apolitical voter, as you would say, as oxymoronic as that
Yeah.
sounds, but the people still feel obligated to vote because it's your right and your duty, the sort of thing they've pushed down your throat for past
If you
50,
don't
60.
vote, you can't complain
Yeah,
ever.
those people, the people who pretty
Thanks
much
for your tax money, though.
yeah, the people who pretty much are him-hawing the decision until they're actually in the booth and they'll regret it afterwards. Those are the kind of people you would risk, and those, unfortunately, are the kind of people who decide elections. But, hey, what are you going to do? But it's pretty much all I had to say for that. I figured I'd just give that a brief coverage now. To talk about a topic or a lot of people haven't talked about in a while. The certain virus, maybe it goes by the name COVID-19, maybe it goes by the name of coronavirus, all these different things. I just know you have to tread lightly when talking about it because,
China.
yeah, the China virus. Okay, that's the COOF. That was another one that got thrown around. All of these various different names, but this particular virus, let's use the word virus. It's very simple. It seems to be spiking all over the world, regardless of lockdowns, regardless of whatever policies in place. I know Western Europe and Europe as a whole has had some spikes. Russia has had some spikes, and I'm sure you've heard plenty of. The United States has had some spikes in it. And it seems to be where we seem to be in the second wave. Now, the good news about this is it seems that the second wave is of a mutated form that is more infectious but less deadly. That was the main thing with the new outbreak
Mhm.
in Italy. That was in northern Italy, in Milan, where yeah, a lot of people are getting infected, but seems to have a be much less lethal than it was last time. So we may be seeing this thing destroy itself. Whereas we saw this with some of the viruses. I think it was actually the Ebola virus in the Congo, where there was an outbreak in 2017, 2018 that mutated itself out of existence. We could be witnessing that right here. Or if you really want to put on tinfoil hats, they're preparing the narrative to end the virus for when Biden gets into office because it is a plot to
Oh
overthrow
yeah.
Trump, which, again, I'll admit, they have used this against Trump to great effect. Some of it is his fault. Again, admittedly, also a lot of it was out of his control, but I could believe that they are picking up on the stories, possibly about it mutating into a less deadly form in order to prepare the seeds for possibly a Democrat to end the lockdowns, whatever. But I do think what we're looking at here is, again, the second wave before it really starts to calm down. Now, for all we
Mhm.
know, there could be a horrible mutation in a third wave, but judging on how these sort of viruses work, now I'm no virologist, but based on previous ones like the other SARS outbreak, MERS, even going all the way back to the Spanish flu, which this is much, much less deadly than, it seems to be the trend when it comes to these sort of pandemics. Now, I do think it's endemic. I do think we will have a COVID season come around every year. I just don't think it will be as deadly as the first time around because again, we don't have an understanding of how to treat, but we have a better understanding than we did before, and it's also not as deadly as we first believed it to be. So I think it's
Yeah.
here to stay. I think it's here something people get infected with, but it won't be a death sentence. Not that it even was a death sentence before, but again, cases are spiking around the world, and people will be talking about that. That will affect the markets. A lot of countries will go into lockdowns. Now, Netherlands went into a lockdown recently, and I think they were one of the ones who were more resistant to even do it in the first place. I think they have a more, I guess what you'd say, neoliberal center right government. So that's not a
Mhm.
surprise. Sweden still hasn't shut down, and again, a lot of places are starting to open up and are reconsidering it. But again, this may, like I said, I don't think it's going to be as severe as last time because honestly, I don't think a lot of people will tolerate it. And I think the political class also realizes they can get away with less harsh lockdowns in order to go with that rather than what they tried to do before. For example, in Italy, which was the case where it was more justified, or in some of these places in the U.S. or even in the U.K. And I know the U.K. has been just the UK has been absolutely ridiculous where they've done a 180 where they refuse to do anything and then they pretty much decided that if you go out you're going to get infected and die. So it's definitely something to keep your eye on. I haven't checked the exact infection numbers, but I know that there have been spikes in several places across the world. At, at least that much.
Yeah. I think the funny thing is how this was yet another event in America, especially considering the last 5 6 years that has been completely politicized. So, if you're a Trump supporter, you're right of center, you don't wear a mask. If you're left of center, you probably do. Now, it's not 100% either way. There are exceptions, but that also has been politicized. And the fact is people like it politicized. People want to project their political affiliation um, vis-a-vis anything that comes into American society. And COVID presents yet another sort of, I don't know, kind of a blank slate that too can be applied. We've discussed before that initially, the Democrats were against lockdown and Trump was for it. They were against it, of course, because they had spent the last 3 years demanding massive migration, supporting the caravans from Central and South America, and so on and so on and so on. And then that got flipped. Once it looked like the markets would be really negatively affected, which was really the main feather in Trump's cap for reelection. Then they went with the lockdown, right? So before, barring the Chinese from entering was racist, and this is just the flu brought. And then he also barred the Europeans, and there was a little less resistance, obviously, because most of them are white. So it's amazing how this is like just another thing that can be um, utilized for political demonstration of affiliation. It's kind of like if you look at basically what has Trump done. There's debates about certainly nothing he promised to do has really happened. You could argue that the fact is the American economy always goes through highs and lows, right? And that maybe it was going to rise up higher than it was under Obama, although it's not really as high as many people think. In any case, here's what I'm getting at. People are what they want. In a way, they sense division, and what they're really fighting for. Trump and Biden are just stand-ins. They don't really reflect what they want, and they really aren't going to accomplish everything that they want.
I did make a joke, sometime earlier that, well, Donald Trump is just an idea. In many ways, Joe Biden is just an idea. As you said, these people are placeholders for whatever cultural or political battle is being waged right now, because, especially with Biden, there's not really a coherent platform. With Trump, there is one, but again, as you said, a lot of it has changed since 2016 to the point where it's been very, let's see, neutered would perhaps be the right word for that. And it's, again, people are more so projecting what they want onto these candidates, which happens in every election, but especially an election like this. So, yeah, it's become more of that than actually what they're standing for in their electoral platforms.
Right. So, you could look at it in a more esoteric way, I suppose, or in a more cyclical, historical way. You could say Trump kind of represents something more Apollonian. You could argue that Biden represents something more Sabellian, possibly Dionysian, if you wanted to get into that territory. The fact is, both don't actually do that. But that is foisted on them, right? The fact, though, is that Western society has just increasingly become more Sabellian, more female rule, right? Christianity is, definitely threatened, definitely in decline. Female power vis-a-vis sexual minorities and racial minorities. We don't even call them minorities. We call them people of color, because in a way we're already preparing that they're not going to be a minority anymore. So you can see that throughout the West and in America in many ways leads it, that there is this Sabellian push, this female-centric power push. And, most of the elites, that's kind of like what they're on board with. Or at least that's what they prescribe for those beneath them. At the very least, you could say that.
Yes, the DMV matriarchy, as I've heard it called, which I think is a very fitting term for it.
Yeah, right. And Republicans can only argue about how they're the better Sabellian candidate, because it was a Republican that ended slavery. It's these ridiculous arguments nobody cares about, except for a few MAGA-pedes, right? So that's what I wanted to say. People can talk, and this is why also I think, especially with reference to the Biden, the Hunter Biden laptop fiasco, and now we have the Tubin Zoomer thing that you can see that the elite class is actually extremely corrupt, and we shouldn't forget that Trump is just as corrupt. He's corrupt in a different way. He is also not in the epicenter of this thing. He is rich and connected, but he's not on the blue team. Well, and I don't mean that he's not a Democrat. I mean, Democrats are closer to the power center of what powers America. That's what I mean by it.
Yeah.
Right? His family, you don't think his family has made similar deals? You don't think his name registers as as a selling point when his children involve themselves in business, right? Like, of course they do. I don't know if it's just as egregious, but I know Kushner is involved in some financial schemes. His father was a schemester, right? Like, but in a way, people don't care because they want to win. There's something that is happening. There is some kind of reckoning day coming, and it may be lackluster. It may not be violent. It may not be what everybody thinks it is. But once it's reached and it goes on the other side, it will be totally irreversible. So there is an epoch that is ending. And the fact of the matter is, people are voting for their candidate that is going to guide them through that. And I don't mean in a kind of direct way. We don't really expect Trump to guide us through that, or that Trump is engaged with his voters on such a subconscious level. Neither is Biden. They're out of this. But I'm saying, we who examine and analyze what is going on, I think we can sense that. That's why they don't care. You could you could disclose another 30,000 emails by Hillary Clinton, and you confirm that, she ate a baby with Abramovich, right? For them, Trump is still a fascist and is still preferable. You're not going to, like, rational arguments in and of themselves aren't persuasive anyways anymore.
Yeah,
People
they hardly
want
were in the
to
first
win.
place, and yeah, especially now. But just to loop back around, like, it seems like the big selling point with Trump is actually that his debauchery is more run of the mill, to the point where, yeah, sure, he had an affair with Stormy Daniels. I don't think he was participating in any child sacrifice rituals in the Bohemian Grove, though. So, like, and not to mention, like I said, I'm sure that Trump's children, his in-laws, they've probably used his name to great effect. So the Hunter stuff, the Biden stuff, isn't really a surprise. But again, there's just something significantly more debauched about the kind of stuff they've been doing versus just the more standard degeneracy of the Trump families. Who would have thought those words would ever be coming out of my mouth at any point under any context? Not me, but I mean, with that, let's move on to some other news about the European Union, Belarus, Russia, and Navalny. Just hit all those together. So the big news was Russia's foreign minister Lavrov has outright threatened that he wants to stop doing deals with the European Union as a bloc. Now, he's still willing to trade with individual member states on a bilateral basis, but in terms of Russia-EU relations, he sort of wants to cease those and, again, hand over maybe a trade deal with Germany or Italy or France in particular, but not a trade deal with Brussels or the European Union, which I think makes sense given the current state of relations, where it seems like Russia has been pretty conciliatory, all things considered. And again, it's a bit odd to say that or think it's going that way, but they are constantly rebuffed by at least the establishment of the European Union. Now, again, Russia has some, I would say, relative friends within the European Union, such as Hungary, such as some Balkan countries, southeastern Europe, maybe like Romania or something. Uh, Italy and Germany to a degree as well. France, that's a whole nother case in of itself. It's a flip flop sort of issue. But again, definitely not in Scandinavia. Definitely not in like Poland or the Baltics. But again, point being, a lot of places are still hostile to Russia and Europe, and the European Union again continues sanctions, whereas individual countries, I was saying, will actually work to lift these sanctions, even ones that come as a bit of a surprise. I think actually the Czech Republic said they want to work towards lifting sanctions on Russia. Maybe it wasn't their exact government, but I'm pretty sure it was either their government or a prominent opposition leader said that, which either way, that's still pretty big. I mean, that's like when Salvini says in Italy, like, yeah, he may not be in charge now, but his word still carries a lot of weight there. Or, for example, what the Social Democrats say in Germany. They're not in charge, but they're still the second largest party or coalition in the country, so, what they say kind of matters. I mean, again, we care about what Pelosi and Schumer say in the United States. Opposition leaders actually do carry a lot of weight, even on the international scale. even though you might not realize it in the direct moment. But that's the main news with Russia and the European Union. And I think this all relates back to, of course, Navalny and Belarus, because, of course, they keep on trying to push Navalny was poisoned. In fact, there was a 60 Minutes interview with him. I was going to watch it. I didn't end up actually putting myself through that. I sort of forgot about it, but so he's making the rounds on Western media, as we predicted. He's really trying to salvage his career like that, being sort of a Kasparov figure who will sit in a foreign country and shake his fist at Putin all day long and not really do anything substantial about it. Just I don't know. Is Navalny active on social media? Because if not, I have a feeling he's going to be very soon, or at least his team's going to be very soon. And we are, as of today, just to round this out, as we record this, this is October 21st. By the time you watch it, it will probably be October 22nd. Tianovskaya's deadline is Sunday, October 25th, for the Day of Reckoning in Belarus. Yeah, that's when the real revolution will start, with our corporate lesbian overlord leading us to victory against the. I've seen the graffiti from the opposition. Stalin plus Hitler equals Lukashenko against the Nazbol Lukashenko, I guess. And
yeah, I don't see a problem here. Yeah, another terrible.
Yeah,
yet another terrible man with a mustache.
Horrible. I know. It's awful. But yeah, her Day of Reckoning is going to be on the 25th, and I'm sure that will be the final, just the straw that breaks the camel's back on Belarus's debauched, dictatorial, evil regime led by evil mustache man. Who knew there'd be so many evil mustache men in the 20th and 21st century? It blows my mind.
Yeah, I mean, she's looking and sounding as ineffectual as Guaido, and people have literally forgotten about this guy. And similarly, that is what's happening with her. All these threats, which are basically there to establish kind of legitimacy, but legitimacy outside the country. She expects to be, I suppose, flown in. It's of course patently ridiculous. She's going to play the dissident, the president who can't be president in her own country. How long she wants to play that, I don't know. I would say she's quite ambitious and is willing to wait, but she might have to wait for a very long time, because I think Russia, Putin definitely want Lukashenko replaced, but they're going to replace him with someone else, someone more effective, someone that is still compliant with Russia and understands what Belarus's position really is. And frankly, that also understands that, considering the strategic location of Belarus, okay, it's very similar to that location for Ukraine, in the sense that it shares a border. You can't go to Kaliningrad by land unless you go through Belarus. It's not as important, of course, as Crimea or the Black Sea. I understand that. But the amount of pressure that would put on Russia would be immense if it was handled correctly. If the West actually had enough money that those countries could become, let's say, far better than what Poland is now. And Poland's not doing too badly, but let's say it would eclipse Poland. Well, then they have a contradiction, because ultimately what they want is they want people to leave those areas and move to Western Europe. That is ultimately the plan. They want to buy up the assets, arable land, resources, even down to tourism, you could argue, right? So there's an inherent contradiction, right? On the one hand, the purpose of this country is only there to basically brain drain it. But on the other hand, if you do that, right, you don't really make that society that much more wealthy. You don't really address what it is that people want there. And if it begins to slide even further, let's say to present day Ukraine, that's not really a winning argument. And there is still an immense amount of naivete amongst the Belarusian people, that they think they will be the exception. Right? That's kind of what's hilarious about it. So,
Even though their revolution, quote unquote, is markedly less nationalistic than some of the other ones in the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, such as you would think mainly Ukraine and Georgia, where they're almost predominantly liberal, where that's who leading it. Whereas in Ukraine and Georgia, it was the nationalists leading it. Of course, the liberals supported it, but so I do think that's something else to consider. But they do think they'll be different in terms of becoming a prosperous society and not just a farm for human capital and labor.
yeah, it's a kind of a magic wand thinking, right? There's nobody on our side that can figure this thing out, but there's people on your side that can. So they have a very romantic and mythological view of the West. They also think that they've also, in some ways, they understand why they're important to the West is because of Russia. But they overestimate how much the West is willing to invest in that country. And the West knows exactly how they're thinking. What the West wants is to, move troops there and, create new missile silos. That's what they want the country for. And once that happens, there is no way they will ever be able to get rid of them. Ever. Unless American society, continues in a rapid decline, much, much faster than what we're seeing now.
Oh yeah, it would require
and eventually cannot support it. It's forever. I mean, Ukraine, but yeah, that's probably for another 2 generations minimum.
Oh yeah, and like you said, barring any major upheaval or upset now, I do
Yeah,
think Belarus may be a bit different in that case. I do think they have much more of a Russian. I'm not saying Ukraine is a small Russian population by any means, but I think Belarus has much more of a Russian population that could turn that tide. But also, we could see what happened in Ukraine, where the ones who are sympathetic to Russia, they just move there outright. They probably have family there as it is. They probably at least know somebody there, somebody who can get them a job, a place to live there. And otherwise, if they're not sympathetic to Russia, it's to Poland, it's to the Czech Republic, it's to even Western Europe and America, as far as they're concerned. So,
yeah,
again, worst case scenario for Belarus is a second Ukraine model with the similar emigration rates and sort of the just depopulation of the country as it falls into a state of dysfunction. But it looks like they've staved that off for now. It looks like Lukashenko is here at least for the time being. Now, I don't know what Russia's greater plans are for him, who they have for a successor, what they have in terms of integration. But I know that, like you said, the West, the European Union, they've dropped the ball on this. They've missed their opportunity to turn Belarus into yet another buffer state in the East. And barring a major, major upheaval, I don't think they're getting it. And they're especially not getting it with Tiavnoskaya. They're going to have to find a new Guaido, as it were, if they want this to happen, because again, nobody wants the globalist corporate lesbian in charge of their country, especially in a country like Belarus.
yeah,
Like, I mean, she's up there as shrill as some of the most insufferable American women politicians. I think Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Klobuchar. Again, they all come from the same sort of mold. They're all cut from the same.
hmm
Yeah, it's like a little cookie cutter of globalist corporate lesbian, and that's the new political class. And honestly, what I'm waiting for to happen is you see the State Department, CIA, they're going to keep putting these people in power in the East, whereas as the West will become more and more trans, it's going to come to a head where eventually the newest geopolitical struggle between East and West will be the transgenders versus the so-called TERFs, and that's the future, I guess, that has been chosen for us at least. And, I guess we got to live with that and, just plug your nose and pick a side or just hide out on an island. Feel free to join me. That's my plan. I just need to find a suitable island. But again, all that all that aside, in all seriousness, it looks like somehow Russia won the day in Belarus. And going on to other fires in the former Soviet Union, it seems like things in Kyrgyzstan actually worked out well for them. Now, there was a major upheaval in Kyrgyzstan over this past week where the former president resigned. And the new president, who is serving an interim role, he was actually in prison for being a nationalist. He came from that background. Let me just get his name here so I pronounce it right. Uh, Sadir Japarov is the new president of Kyrgyzstan, who is standing for election, current interim president. When the elections will be, it doesn't say, but he is staying there. And one of his first major diplomatic acts in office was to meet with the Russian ambassador and praise Russia for their role in the region. So, typically, when you get these sort of things, you get a very pro Western, pro liberal, pro democracy sort of message out of it. But it seems to have gone the exact opposite way. Now, I know Kyrgyzstan was ostensibly pro Russia under their current president, whose name was, I'm probably going to botch the pronunciation of this, but let me just look it up. It's very long and confusing, but it's like Jernu. Yeah, forget it. If you can look it up, it's got like three O's in a row in it. I cannot pronounce it for the life of me. But what he was is pretty much your standard former post-Soviet politician, ostensibly pro-Russia, willing to let the West in the back door, etc. But it honestly seems like this current replacement he has, who's standing for election, is much more sympathetic to the Russian view, which again is a surprise. Now, destabilization in that kind of country, and with an election coming up, the fortunes could change quick. He could be a turncoat. He could be removed from office. He could lose the election to the point where this isn't necessarily guaranteed, but I don't know. I just am surprised how calm of a resolution this came to, and especially considering the result it came to.
Yeah, I still honestly haven't figured out what the repercussions of this are going to be. I thought, really within the first 2 days that there was going to be a change of power. I don't know how much autonomy Kyrgyzstan is really ever going to have, how much they're capable of establishing that.
Well, the neo-Turnists are going to take
Also,
power, and Erdogan's
I
also
don't
just going to
yet
bail them out.
hear. That's right. That's right. He's going to lead their Khaganate. Um, and frankly, I don't really see America really moving in on this. I could be wrong. Maybe it's happening several levels underneath, but I don't see it. It's still not there, and that could be because America's become so incoherent in the last few years, especially domestically.
Yeah, and also to keep in mind, Kyrgyzstan, the former president who just resigned is Sarunbay Yinbekov, and it's a J, but I'm gonna assume it's pronounced as a Y sound, judging on the region. And he only came into power in 2017 after being prime minister. And Kyrgyzstan is they go through political leaders fast, and doesn't necessarily indicate a color revolution every time. It just seems like sort of like the case in pre-revolutionary Ukraine, where they would just go through president after president. The only one who got reelected was Yanukovych, who eventually was overthrown. But so it seems like one of those cases where they really just can't find their footing with stable political leadership. So I don't read too much into it as either a color revolution or either as securing Kyrgyzstan for the pro-Russia camp. It just seems like business as usual there, for being honest.
Yeah, yeah. That's basically how I see it.
Now, moving on to the other part of the former Soviet Union, the Caucasus, and oh boy, it's been a bad week for Armenia. They have
Yeah.
consistently lost ground. Kyrgyzstan, with their mercenary forces and their Turkish support, have continually moved in. Russia has managed to stay out of it thus far because it hasn't gone beyond Nagorno-Karabakh, the disputed region, or just for the sake of neutrality, Artsakh, as the Armenians would call it, and it really looks like you were saying that this region is more Armenian than Kosovo is Albanian, so one would think it would be a hard sell in order to get Azeri control over it, unless they're planning on doing like full ethnic cleansing, like reaching genocide levels. But I don't know. I don't know whether this is just going to be where they're going to push in and then withdraw and force some sort of humiliating peace terms on this region or Armenia at large, perhaps. Again, I don't really see the end goal of Armenia is to defend the autonomy of Artsakh, or Nagorno-Karabakh, or this particular region, we'll call
Hmm.
it, just to avoid any upset. And I really don't see Azerbaijan and by extent Turkey's end goal with this. What what do they want? They keep on pushing. Is it just for the projection power to humiliate Armenia? Because, like I said, I don't think annexation of this region is in the question unless they want to absorb a large foreign population or commit a massive ethnic cleansing.
Hmm. Yes, yeah, that's something I said right from the start. Now it could be that they really, you know, it could be that they really are going to go through with this. And we we have mentioned before that small populations, small distinct ethnicities, not well known throughout the world, um, put an extra effort, about their ethnicity, their history, their identity, because it's far more easy to roll over these smallest ethnicities, and to the point that they just essentially disappear from the earth. It's happened hundreds of times, and it could be that this battle is basically about that, about reigniting, but at what cost? How worth is it? Um, yes, you're going to, like, in 1828, the Azeri population there was much higher, but that's nearly 200 years ago. And the rest of the world won't look at it that way. Uh, so, how far can this really go? Obviously, this is about getting Russia involved. Russia so far has supplied weapons to Armenia. But the fact of the matter is Armenia has to take a gamble, right? Armenia has not been willing to gamble, let's say, to the point where, like, their own country is going to get maybe bombed. Now, they can, for the moment, look at Nagorno-Karabakh as like, well, it's a region. It's technically Armenian, but it's not Armenia proper, and so on. But it's not looking good. This doesn't look strong. And as you say, they're conceding a lot of land. And if they don't change that situation, they won't be able to rearm those forces there. So they either do something now, or they're going to lose, a certain amount of territory. Now, the strategy could be that, well, um, they're going to let Azerbaijan take even more. They're going to put a stiff resistance to a certain point, and they're going to sue for peace. And they'll win it because Azerbaijan will look like a total aggressor, and the world will go along with them. Well, you know what? You might think that, but I don't see a tremendous amount of support for that.
Yeah, and even with the
America.
massive Armenian lobbies in Western countries, particularly the United States and France, both have huge ones. Russia, and I don't know if you want to consider it Western, but in terms of major powers with an Armenian lobby, couple million there at least who have quite a bit of political, background. Not to mention, Lavrov himself comes from an Armenian background. I believe his it's either his mother or his father's Armenian. I think he has a Russified version of
His
an Armenian
father's
last name.
Armenian.
Yes, that.
Sorry, I think sorry. His dad, I think,
Yeah, like I
is
said,
Russian, but his mom was Armenian.
he has some Armenian blood somewhere recently. Is the point that's
Yeah,
being? He was,
I think.
yeah, and he was also born in Georgia, so he's from the region. This is a place that is actually would be personal to him, and he's sort of, I don't know, one of Putin's right hand men, if you want to say. I'd say he's one of Putin's
Mm-hmm.
closer cabinet members, advisors, etc. But so you have that. But even with all, it seems like the disproportionate amount of influence they have, considering the size of their country and their ethnic group in general, they really can't sell the case. Now, to compare it to another case, imagine if Egypt was pushing into the Negev right now with Israel. Don't you think the American Jewish lobbies and the ones in Western Europe and Russia would be outraged right now and action would be getting done? And think about, I'd say they're of comparable size in terms of lobbies and maybe not in terms of nations, but in terms, like I said, the sort of influence they can exert through lobbies. Again, I think Israel, of course, has much more, but Armenia, again, it's nothing, it's no slouch, it's nothing to laugh at in terms of that sort of field. But I don't know, it just seems like they're not utilizing that raw political capital they have right there, or they are, but it's falling on deaf ears. And I figured maybe the communities that have come westward have just lost that much connection with their heritage, with their roots.
Hmm.
Wouldn't be surprised, especially with a lot of the ones living in the West Coast in California and Los Angeles of all places. Oh boy, that's a place where cultures come to die. But whatever. But I figure at least the Russian lobby would, and like I said, with Lavrov of all people in a position of foreign policy influence at that something more would have been done already. So, yeah, like you said, I think the entire world is just going to go along with Azerbaijan because it seems like the West is going along with Azerbaijan for whatever reason. Well, I mean, again, there's several reasons, but again, like I wouldn't have been surprised if a lot of the Western powers did rally around Armenia. I was expecting at least some of them. I know France technically has, but I wouldn't have even been surprised if for example, the United States or even some like Democratic politicians or some politicians in the United States came out in support of Armenia. But that didn't happen. Now, again, the United States, as we've discussed previously, way too focused on internal issues to focus more on external issues. But I don't know. I was expecting a bigger rallying in the West, sort of as I don't know, an attack on Christianity, as it were, because that's the way they were trying to paint it early on. Now they're defaulting to liberal universalism arguments about what are ostensibly called human rights, and those also seem to be falling on deaf ears. So, it's really a shame what happened. Like I said, my sympathies were personally way more on the Armenian side, and it just seems like they've been outmaneuvered this time, and they're probably going to be forced into a humiliating peace, which is going to only embolden Turkey and its allies like Azerbaijan.
Right, and you see where you have these small protests, often no more than 5 or 6 people, maybe 20, 25. And you see who is at, which flags are being presented in favor of Azerbaijan. Well, you're going to see an Israeli flag. You're going to see a Georgian flag, a Ukrainian flag, besides of course, Azerbaijani, and you're going to see a Turkish flag. And so what are they doing? Well, I mean, I don't want to claim who's leading who here, but there are some politically savvy people who can intuitively understand that it's in their interest to push America to side with Azerbaijan because it would represent a defeat to Russia. Countries like Georgia and Ukraine are obsessed with the destruction of Russia. I mean, it's an obsession with them, right? And so whether, their position for the U.S. is something that is momentarily feasible or whether the long-term benefits are present, they don't care, right? What they're going to do is they're going to pressure as much as possible. They're going to create a kind of axis, right, of support. And so if America isn't already engaged in that, or the local governments are not already engaged in that, well, at the local level, there will be people who will be engaged in that, who will see the connection, because they want a kind of consistency. Russia always, always, always bad, always side with whoever, even indirectly, could harm Russia, right? That's their approach. So it's an obsessive thing. You see this also, like, with the war in Syria, right? So, Ukraine was, for the rebels. Anybody that was fighting Assad is indirectly fighting is indirectly fighting against Putin as well, right? So that's the way they view it, and they're bargaining that they're going to get support for their guy, or for that country over there that can help them out. So, and I'm not seeing the same kind of I'm not seeing the same kind of support. Like, I see photos from people protesting at a consulate, and frankly, when I see one for the Armenians, I just see Armenian flags. I don't see a lot of other flags.
Yeah, not even like French or Russian, which are pretty much the two who have two foreign powers, which I'd say have done the most for him so far. And
Yeah.
just to touch on this, I think the one positive thing we can say out of this, at least the war in Azerbaijan did not take a particularly Islamic flair, because that could have been very dangerous with Dagestan and Chechnya right across the border, to the point where it could have caused even more trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so far it just seems to have been limited to a more nationalistic flair and been more secular in that regard, which makes sense for, on paper, a lot of Azeris will call themselves Muslims, but again, sort of like the Christians who go to church twice or three times a year and generally hold loosely to the practices and still keep it as a cultural identity. That's what Shia Islam in Azerbaijan has pretty much become. So it's not like Iran or Turkey or Saudi Arabia, where it actually is still a deeply held faith, which, like, because I think if that were the motivation behind this, number one, Azerbaijan would probably have a lot more condemnation with Islamic radicalism, and especially they try to tie it to Iran and being a Shia country and everything. I mean, they even tie non-Shia stuff to Iran, like ISIS and Al Qaeda. They've done that before, but especially with, again, Muslim-heavy regions across the border in Russia, could have been much worse than what is today. Could have been a complete powder keg in the Caucasus. But as unfortunate as this situation is, I'd hate to play the optimist card right now. It could be worse, and things usually tend to get worse after you say that. But I mean, regardless, unfortunately, I think Armenia is going to be forced into a humiliating peace, which, again, I don't know what that will spell for their fate. I doubt they're going to be annexed by any neighboring country such as Turkey or Azerbaijan. I doubt there's going to be full annexation. But again, I think Armenia is going to be particularly weakened, and we could see a case where the Russian support either wasn't enough or wasn't effective enough to the point where, yeah, they take this humiliation and Armenia just fully caves and gives into neoliberalism and joins the quote-unquote Western alliance. That could be the end goal of this ultimately. I'm not going to say for sure, but something to keep in mind.
Right, and I did see something interesting from some of the Russian Twitter accounts, and during the coup, well, yeah, I guess it was a revolution. Nothing quite like the revolution of 1917, but when the Soviet Union fell and their parliamentary building was bombed, it was actually Armenians that did that. And they also attempted to bomb one of the trains on the metro. So, I think it's like it's more hit and miss than people think. The relationship with Russia and Armenia. I would say generally overall, Armenians have very good opinions about Russia.
Oh yeah,
and a lot of them, and a hell of a lot of them live there. But And I personally know a good friend of mine that is Armenian that was born and raised in Russia.
And like I
And
said, not to mention Lavrov himself, and I imagine just with the way
yeah,
nepotism works, Lavrov probably has a lot of people of partial or full Armenian descent working for him, or at least pro-Armenia sympathies. Now, I don't know how much he's expressed how much he values his heritage, but I imagine there's at least got to be something.
yeah.
But I suppose that wraps up the Caucasus for now, looking ever bleaker by the week, unfortunately. And speaking of ever bleaker, we're going to talk a little bit about Lebanon and one Macron. So, Macron, after trying to play the hero for about 3 months now, 2 months, it was in early early August, so 2.5 months will split the difference. Has washed his hand of this. He was very insulting towards the Lebanese political class, saying they're disgusting, they're animals, insulting them, which isn't entirely unwarranted, I'll say. But he did
Hmm.
default, and again, not that I have any stock or investment in Hezbollah, but he did default to the Western position that we can't make any deals because it's all Hezbollah's fault. They're the only group obstructing me in these negotiations. Nobody else. Not just Lebanon's a complete dysfunctional system, regardless of party. It's that in particular. Please love me, Israel. That I mean, kind of what a statement boiled down to. But this was no surprise considering what he had been faced with. Not to mention the domestic issues going on in the West. Calling it quits this early is probably a good idea. And he's got an election coming up in, again, like a year and a half. So we'll see how that turns out for him. But he just picked up and abandoned the situation. Now, it seems like France was the only country really working to keep Lebanon afloat. So the political situation there could deteriorate very quickly. And we could see I wouldn't say another civil war. Again, we've discussed the problems with that earlier on when this explosion, when the crisis in Lebanon first happened. But we could see a lot of divisions, a lot of social unrest, and even more dysfunction out of that country now that France has sort of washed its hands of it. And I do think it's funny that Macron came in, in the emperor role to reestablish the county of Tripoli and leaving just looking like, again, yet another, pencil neck neoliberal because he has his moments, but at the end of the day, unfortunately, that's mostly what it is. But I really don't see things going in a positive direction from here. Now, this may be their final push trying to sanction or bomb Hezbollah out of existence because I know Israel's been active in Syria against Hezbollah and Iranian-backed forces in and near the Golan Heights, so that could be a precursor to what we see in Lebanon proper. But again, the situation I think for Lebanon is only going to get worse because, like I said, I imagine with the pulling out is going to be a cut in aid. And as I said, who was propping up Lebanon before this? Primarily France. Now, of course, the other international powers chipped in, but it seemed like they were taking responsibility for their former colony, and they must have remembered why they left in the first place and left again. So we'll see how the situation plays out there. I'm not very optimistic for the future of Lebanon. I think actually that's going to be the next spot of mass emigration, especially considering the fact there's a lot of actually very educated people that come from Lebanon. A lot of high skill immigrants come from Lebanon, go all over the Western world, go all over the world. A lot in the United States alone. So I do think they are sort of doomed to that same fate. They're probably the next mass emigration target. Now, whether we'll get refugee rafts coming out of there like we do from Libya, I doubt it, but I do think we're going to see a lot of brain drain coming from that country, even more so than in the previous decades.
I think bringing up that this will be a another um, infight, but an infight without the bombing, because that has basically been the approach for the last 30 years, especially if you consider the first Gulf War. Um, what we have is, bomb, what is it? Invade, invite. And this is, depending on who you think was responsible for the explosion in the harbor, or whether anyone is maliciously responsible or not. you know, is almost secondary at this point. If that happens, though, I will say this: those, Hamas and its elements and their elements will not leave. Hamas is absolutely more tied to that land than the Sunnis.
Hamas or Hezbollah?
Sorry. Yeah, Hezbollah.
Yeah, I was wondering since I know there's a lot of different Palestinian fronts in Lebanon, so
just what happened.
He's having a stroke on us. I'm gonna have to get. He's going Biden. I'm gonna have to get a new co-host. Look, I'm open to audience. I'm open to audience applications. Just hit me up.
Right, but I mean, objectively, you can see this. If you look at those Iranians that are, or those Shia that are fighting, against American interests, against Zionist interests, they're Hezbollah, right? They're not going anywhere. They're not leaving in droves. Everybody who leaves the land, will tell you like, well, it was just crazy. It was violent. All that's true. And, we're waiting for the country to get better and, we might go back. The vast majority will not go back.
Yeah, especially out of Lebanon, that's the case with a lot of the Christian populations where, unfortunately, they've sort of thrown up the white flag on that and abandoned their ancient homelands at that. And, I mean, again, but I imagine with them, maybe in previous decades now, so with as much as a secular hellhole the West became, at least back then they may have had an easier time integrating into the West. But yeah, just as an aside to that.
And you could argue that maybe this is also why the Azerbaijanis might be winning. They feel more tied to that land. They're more willing to die for it and to kill for it, right? And so, yeah, people will leave Lebanon because, again, how much does the West really invest in these countries? What are their real objectives? Their objectives don't match the investment that they purport they'll deliver. So, and amazingly, it's been shown repeatedly, right? So people understand the playbook. So if people do leave, well, I have a strong feeling that that's going to be okay for Hezbollah. I don't think Hezbollah is going to leave.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of their supporters either are going to leave. Like you said, I think the Shia Muslims out of any religious group, between the various Christian groups, the Sunni Muslims, I think they're the ones who are most entrenched and willing to fight for their cause. Now, I also think that correlates to, again, wanting to live and die on that land if they feel the need to. Whereas a lot of groups are more so willing to throw in the towel and seek their prospects in life elsewhere, which, I'm kind of sympathetic to myself with the current state of things going on right now. So I can't really say much about that, but I do think you bring up a point that it only stands to benefit them, and we could see a massive demographic shift just by emigration alone. Now, like I said, I don't think these are going to be refugee rafts where they're just putting up their boats and sailing out like they did from the Eastern Mediterranean or Libya, for example. But I think there'll be a lot of, again, especially high-skilled immigration, a lot of doctors, a lot of technical people leaving the country, heading westward, which, I mean, compared to all the different immigrant groups, like, if I had to pick one, I don't think Lebanese would be as bad as most. But that's just my personal opinion. And
also take a look at Syria.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The vast majority of people who left are Sunni. I mean, there's Christians amongst them. I'm sure there's even Alawites amongst them. But
yeah,
the vast majority.
Yeah, also in Syria, it seems like the Christians more so than Lebanon, maybe it comes to being a absolute minority group like they are in Syria, they were more willing to stand their ground and live and die by it rather than just pick up and go. Whereas the Sunni Syrians, who are like 85% of the population, didn't feel the same way. And it is interesting because I think emigration just from that region in general, even post-war, is still going to be a lot. And who knows what Turkey's going to do with all those refugees. That could be an issue again coming up in the near future. But with that, because you brought it up, I suppose we'll briefly cover Libya and Syria and then get out of here.
Yeah.
So, Syria, right now, more active than in previous weeks, with Turkish convoys were allegedly withdrawing. Now, there's some who entered the country. Now, I don't know how much that is just like to pick up people and go, or pick up supplies and go. Could very well be that. The shelling has been much less intensive, only a couple spots right by the northeastern border and right by the occupied zone. So there's that. There was a coalition raid with SDF forces near the near Deir ez-Zor, where they actually arrested several prominent ISIS members. Idlib keeps continuing, a lot of shelling by pro-Assad forces, a lot of bombing by Russia, so that continues to shrink as they retreat. There were ISIS attacks in Hama. There were explosions in Al-Raqqa that were probably tied to ISIS. But the biggest news, surprisingly enough, well, not really surprising, but something we haven't heard in a while, is Israeli operations in the Golan Heights against Iranian-backed forces. That seems to be the new focus of news in Syria, because it looks like Idlib is actually going along very smoothly, all things considered, with a lot of things happening going in Russia's way, and especially if this Turkish withdrawal is a full withdrawal, I think that's supposed to be the end of Idlib. But it looks like Israel now, they haven't attacked any Syrian government forces or Russian forces, but they're going after pro-Iranian and Iranian-backed forces, which, again, I think is probably what... Again, I think that Syria will concede that they won't make stink about it, and I think Russia will concede that, so long it's not a direct killing of actual Syrian proper forces. And I don't think Israel's going to push all the way into Damascus, for example, but I do think they're going to intensify operations, especially as the war on the Idlib front draws to a close, and especially that's a victory for Assad.
Yeah. Russia has stepped up their campaign. They're bombing even more so than they were last week, in and outside Greater Idlib. Turkish forces are kind of realigning. They're going toward Afrin. I believe one of their columns actually ran over 2 children, killing one of them. These are little children, like under 10. And the columns were also attacked in Idlib, the province Idlib, outside of Idlib city, by HTS. So is that because they're withdrawing and they feel abandoned now, or is it some other dispute? In any case, I think we are looking at basically Assad taking Idlib. And in a way, Turkey has to make this move, right? You could argue that there's this greater push towards the north to deal with the Kurds, and involving itself with Azerbaijan and Armenia. But yeah, it's given up on Idlib. So all those observational posts, we're going to see a lot of them abandoned, and they'll be taken over by Syrians.
I wonder, similar to the fall of Aleppo, if this will preclude a lot of groups just surrendering without a fight because they honestly just don't think it's worth it anymore. Now, there'll be the diehards who want to die for their cause. Many of those will probably become things like suicide bombers or just your run-of-the-mill terrorists. But I think a lot of your conventional fighters, especially the ones just doing it for the money, will either pack up and leave, which, again, a lot of those people weren't from Syria in the first place. But I think it's going to be where, like it was in Aleppo, a lot of the people who were actually Syrians and lived there or lived in Syria in general will just turn in their arms and accept the amnesty offers that have been put out previously and go on about their lives. Not happy about the government, but accepting the consequences of it, because, like I said, if they were really that convicted, they'd either be dying for it or going elsewhere to fight, such as Azerbaijan or Libya.
Yeah, they don't seem particularly happy to go fight in Nagorno-Karabakh. Their casualties are pretty high. I know everybody is inflating the numbers. there. And Armenia said like they think they've killed 6,000 Azerbaijanis. I really find that hard to believe, and the figures from Azerbaijan are almost as ridiculous. I mean, they're high. Uh, at this point, they're well over 1,000 or 2,000. I'm really
Well, and that's also the thing, because I forgot to mention them, but the Armenians found a bunch of soldiers who were presumed dead to still be alive. So, again, these counts are far from accurate.
right, right. Um, so you know, I guess we already saw Erdogan spreading his forces, and we did kind of predict like this eventually won't go well for Idlib, because without the Turkish forces there, they don't really represent much of a challenge to the Syrians now. The Syrians will have hardware that's easily as good, if not better, and numerically they're going to outnumber them, which will bode well for other areas in Syria, particularly in that central area south of the Euphrates. So, I guess he's like I say. I think with Erdogan, the main concern was the Kurds, and honestly, like what are his plans? He can't really destroy them all without negating his membership in NATO. I think that would be too much. The Americans are at least willing there to be there in order to dissuade him from that. Like, you could argue that the Syrians and the Russians dare not hurt the Kurds, but you could also say the same thing about Turkey. Yes, I know, they've got Afrin and all that, but I think there's a limit. I don't think the U.S. wants Turkey to annex that region. I don't think they will allow it.
Oh no, and I mean, I kind of hope Turkey takes that gambit so the West may, in its short-sightedness, overreact, they would expel Turkey from NATO, thereby making the organization practically defunct. That's my ultimate hope out of this.
Yeah.
I don't think it will happen, though, but with somebody like Erdogan, he likes to push his luck, and I don't know, especially under, ironically enough, a Biden administration, that would be more likely to happen. So we could end up in an odd timeline. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but just for the thought experiment of it, we could end up in a timeline where Biden, in outrage, expels Turkey from NATO over the Kurds, and pretty much defangs NATO as an entire organization. So, yeah, just keep in mind all the odd little possibilities that exist out there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll go this far. I'll say that Biden would be tougher on Turkey than Trump, because ultimately the Obama administration did not want Erdogan as president.
Oh, absolutely not. They took a party shot at him.
Not that they had a coherent plan for Syria. They didn't. But they did not want what Erdogan was doing.
Oh, of course not.
That backfired, and it didn't work. However, if Biden wins, I would expect them to be harder on Turkey.
I mean, Biden even tacitly put out again, his Twitter staff at least, even tacitly put out a pro-Armenian statement at the beginning of the conflict in the Caucasus. So we could see a very odd sort of synthesis, very odd sort of contradiction of policies under a Biden administration, with the tough on Russia talk, but also not tolerating Turkey, who, again, is a key player in the U.S., the NATO anti-Russia strategy. So, again, odd times ahead. And ironically enough, we're starting to see a more coherent foreign policy under Trump. Maybe just because he's been in office for 4 years and we kind of know what to expect. But you figure, even from somebody who would ostensibly support Trump, they would say Biden would have a more coherent foreign policy, just a more disagreeable one. But it looks like even that's not true anymore. Who knows what his administration would do? Who knows which horse they would bet on, to quote loosely Lord Salisbury.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. So, the real fight, I think, is going to be for Turkey's to consolidate something in, in that whole territory around Afrin. And I can't see them really pushing to take that northern part of Syria on the other side of the Euphrates. Um, the best he can hope for is like some kind of sliver of land, and I don't even think it's going to cover his entire border with Syria.
Oh no,
That
it's and
like a buffer, a new buffer border where Turkey goes in a little bit further, but it's really there to just create a buffer between it and, there's a lot of Kurds already in Turkey proper, and he has to think about like what are going to be the repercussions for him if he begins going really, wholesale on Kurds there. So who knows? In a year, even with Trump in power, he might decide to move out. I think it's a strong possibility. His two strongest geopolitical motions right now are in Azerbaijan and in Libya.
yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And also, one thing to consider is we've mentioned this about Assad's forces and about the rebels. That as of the day we're recording this, which is October 21st, 2020, we are about 3 months out from the inauguration of possibly a new president. Because if Biden wins, inauguration day is on January 20th, as it always is. So we could see where they only have 3 months to take whatever actions they want to. Now, again, I tend to agree that they may actually back off of Syria now that they have ambitions elsewhere. But I was gonna do Libya. There wasn't much news out of it, and we're running a bit long. So I think that does it for today.
Yeah, I don't, Libya is kind of a stalemate right now.
Yeah. But thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode of the War Report, the second to last episode before the election. Next week will be a very interesting week, probably very election heavy. So you've been warned. Of course, we'll cover all the other news around the world from the week, but I mean it's that final stretch, and the debates will be on if you're watching the premiere of this within like 2 hours or so. So have fun with those, I guess. We're probably going to make a review show of that over the weekend. We'll see how it goes. If it's that fascinating, we will. If not, we'll just tack it on to our show next week. But thank you, everyone, for tuning into this little bit longer episode of the War Report. We'll see you next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye. Take care.